There's a researcher at the National Institutes of Health who spent years studying people who lost massive amounts of weight and then gained almost all of it back. What she found had nothing to do with willpower, discipline, or motivation. It had to do with a measurement almost nobody talks about when they give weight loss advice. The people in her study had done everything right, reduced calories significantly, exercised intensely, lost the weight, and then 6 years later, researchers measured their resting metabolic rate, the number of calories the body burns at rest, and found something that changed how scientists understand fat loss permanently. Their metabolism was burning approximately 500 calories per day less than expected for their current body size, not less than before they lost the weight, less than what any standard calculation would predict for a person of their exact height, weight, and body composition, 6 years later, even after gaining most of the weight back. The diet had changed the metabolism in a way that persisted for years. That study is one of 5 pieces of science this video is built on, and mistake number 4 on this list is the one that accelerates fat loss while you sleep. Most people are doing the exact opposite and eliminating the benefit entirely without knowing it. Subscribe now because the follow-up video covers how to fix all 5 of these without starting over from zero. Think of your body as a precision laboratory. Every variable you change triggers a response in 3 other systems you are not trying to touch. Reduce calories, and the laboratory immediately recalibrates energy output to match. Add more cardio, and the laboratory reduces spontaneous movement during the rest of the day to compensate. Remove dietary fat, and the laboratory begins reducing the hormones that regulate fat burning itself. It is not a simple input and output machine. Every intervention triggers a counter-response, and the 5 mistakes on this list all have one thing in common. People make them because they are logical, because they make sense on the surface, and because nobody told them about the laboratory's counter-response. Mistake number 1, eating too little. This is the most common fat loss strategy, and the one with the most well-documented backfire mechanism in the research. The study mentioned at the beginning of this video was published in the journal Obesity in 2016 by Fothergill and colleagues. They followed contestants from the Biggest Loser competition, people who had lost approximately 40% of their body weight through extreme caloric restriction and intense exercise. 6 years after the competition, most had regained the majority of the weight. And their resting metabolic rate was suppressed by roughly 500 calories per day, below what science predicted for their size. This phenomenon is called adaptive thermogenesis. The body interprets aggressive caloric restriction as famine. The laboratory recalibrates. Thyroid output drops. NEAT, the spontaneous movement that happens outside of exercise, decreases. Muscle tissue, which is metabolically expensive to maintain, becomes a target for reduction. The body makes itself as efficient as possible to survive the perceived shortage. The problem is that this adaptation persists. The laboratory does not reset when the diet ends. It continues operating in energy conservation mode for months, and in some cases years after the restriction has stopped. The result, the person who loses weight through extreme restriction ends up with a lower metabolic rate than someone of the same size who never dieted. Every future attempt at weight loss happens against a depressed baseline. The fix is not to stop restricting calories. It is to restrict them moderately, a deficit of around 300 to 500 calories per day rather than 1,000, and to prioritize protein and resistance training to preserve metabolic tissue during the process. Mistake number 2. Doing chronic steady-state cardio as the primary fat loss tool. Cardio burns calories during the session. That part is true. The part nobody explains is what happens between the sessions. The body adapts to cardio efficiently and quickly. Within weeks of consistent cardio training, the body begins reducing NEAT during the hours outside the session to compensate for the energy spent during it. Research on this compensation effect shows that the more cardio someone adds to their routine without changing diet, the more the body reduces background movement to maintain energy balance. Additionally, chronic elevated intensity steady-state cardio maintains cortisol at higher levels across the day. Cortisol is not the enemy in short bursts. Acute cortisol from exercise is part of the adaptation signal, but chronically elevated cortisol specifically promotes visceral fat storage, the metabolically dangerous fat that accumulates around the abdominal organs. The practical consequence: someone running 45 minutes every day on a treadmill, burning 300 calories per session, may be unconsciously reducing NEAT by enough to cancel 200 of those calories, while maintaining cortisol levels that redirect some of the remaining deficit towards storing fat in the wrong places. Resistance training produces a different laboratory response. It builds metabolically active tissue that raises resting energy expenditure permanently, creates an EPOC effect that continues burning calories for hours after the session, and does not trigger the same chronic cortisol elevation that prolonged steady-state cardio does. Cardio is not the enemy. It is a poor primary fat loss tool when used in isolation at chronic steady-state intensity. Mistake number 3, removing dietary fat. This mistake comes from decades of advice that conflated dietary fat with body fat. The logic seemed sound. Fat has more than twice the calories per gram compared to protein or carbohydrate. Remove it and the calories drop dramatically. The laboratory's counterresponse: leptin production declines. Leptin is the hormone produced primarily by fat cells that signals satiety to the brain and regulates energy expenditure. Dietary fat intake directly influences leptin sensitivity and production. When fat intake drops significantly, leptin levels drop with it, increasing hunger, reducing the signal to burn stored fat, and making the brain believe the body is in a state of scarcity. Additionally, testosterone, estrogen, and other fat-soluble hormones are produced from cholesterol and depend on adequate dietary fat intake. Chronically low fat intake in men has been associated with measurably lower testosterone levels. Lower testosterone reduces muscle protein synthesis, reduces the body's capacity to build and maintain lean tissue, and slows resting metabolic rate over time. The laboratory needs fat to run its fat-burning machinery efficiently. Removing the raw material does not make the machine more effective, it makes it slower. Mistake number 4, not sleeping enough. This is the one that works in both directions. Done correctly, sleep is the most powerful fat loss tool most people are not using. Done poorly, it systematically dismantles every other effort. A study by Spiegel, Tazali, Penev, and Van Cotter published in the Annals of Internal Medicine in 2004 measured what happened when healthy young men were restricted to 4 hours of sleep for 2 consecutive nights. Leptin dropped by 18%, ghrelin rose by 28%, hunger increased significantly, and the cravings specifically shifted toward high-calorie, high-carbohydrate foods. 18% less satiety hormone, 28% more hunger hormone after 2 nights. Now multiply that across weeks and months of consistently short or poor sleep. The laboratory is running with a permanent hunger signal elevated by nearly 30% and a satiety signal suppressed by nearly 20%. Against that hormonal environment, calorie tracking becomes nearly impossible, not because of willpower, but because the internal signals that regulate intake have been systematically disrupted. And cortisol from sleep deprivation specifically directs the body to store fat around the abdomen, compounding the visceral fat effect described in mistake number 2. Getting 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep is not recovery. It is an active metabolic intervention that resets the hormonal environment for fat loss. Mistake number 5, ignoring chronic stress. Research by Appel and colleagues at Yale University measured cortisol reactivity in women, how strongly their cortisol spiked in response to stressful situations, and then analyzed where they stored body fat. The finding was direct. Women with higher cortisol reactivity accumulated more abdominal fat, even among those who were lean overall. Even without excess body weight, higher cortisol reactivity predicted more visceral fat. The mechanism: cortisol activates lipoprotein lipase in visceral fat cells, an enzyme that specifically promotes fat storage in the abdominal region. Chronically elevated cortisol also promotes gluconeogenesis, breaking down muscle tissue to generate glucose. Over time, this reduces lean tissue, depresses metabolic rate, increases abdominal fat, and worsens insulin sensitivity, creating the metabolic conditions that make fat loss progressively harder. Every fat loss effort that is layered on top of chronic unmanaged stress is operating at a disadvantage the calorie math does not account for. Before the protocol, nothing here replaces medical guidance. If you have a history of disordered eating, thyroid conditions, hormonal disorders, or cardiovascular disease, speak with your doctor before making significant changes to diet, exercise, or sleep protocols. The 5 corrections are simpler than the mistakes suggest. Moderate the deficit instead of maximizing it. 300 to 500 calories below maintenance preserves metabolic rate while still producing fat loss. Replace most chronic steady-state cardio with resistance training 2 to 3 times per week. Add shorter, higher-intensity cardio sessions rather than long daily sessions. Keep dietary fat at approximately 25 to 35% of total calories. Prioritize sources like eggs, fish, avocado, and olive oil. Treat sleep as a performance variable. 7 to 9 hours with consistent sleep and wake times resets the hormonal environment more powerfully than most supplements. Manage cortisol actively, not through motivation or positive thinking, through structural changes like consistent sleep timing, removing unnecessary stressors, and not attempting extreme dietary restriction during high-stress periods. The laboratory does not respond to effort, it responds to the signal each variable sends. The same effort applied with the right signals produces a completely different result. If this changed how you think about fat loss, subscribe and leave a like. Tell me in the comments, which of these 5 were you doing without realizing it was working against you? Next video, the specific hormonal protocol that combines all 5 corrections into a single daily structure, and why the order you implement them matters as much as the corrections themselves.